Okay, welcome back. In the previous video, I showed you how to turn on the Developer tab so that we can begin to create macros. Now, let's talk about what a macro is. When you're doing something in Excel and you find yourself doing a repetitive task, there's a way to record a macro where you turn on a recorder and then you do a sequence of tasks. And by that I mean pretty much anything you want. You can create a chart, you can enter a formula, you can change formatting, and then at the end of that process you stop recording and you give a name to that macro. And then from that point on, if you want to repeat all the steps that you recorded, you just run that macro, and in a split second it just redoes everything that you did before. And so what it does essentially is it takes the steps that you're doing in editing cells and formulas and charts, and it converts it to a Visual Basic script and records that for you. And you can go in and modify that code and put it in a loop and make it iterate, and you can do some incredibly powerful things. And in some ways, one of the benefits of a macro is you can sometimes when I'm programming, working with Excel, I say, well, I want to write some code to do something, like, for example, run goal-seek, but I don't know how to I don't know how to format the Visual Basic code to do that. Well, one quick way to do that is just record a macro and run goal-seek or whatever, then go look at the macro code, and there it is. So it's a way to in fact, that's one of the ways I learned years ago how to program in Visual Basic, is by recording macros and look at the code. So to get a nice introduction to how to record macros, we're going to use this use case here, and we're going to create a few macros and run them and look at the code and start getting our feet wet here in terms of Visual Basic programming in Excel. And you know, there are two ways you can record macros using absolute addresses or relative addresses. By default, we do absolute macros, so we're going to record some absolute macros, and then in our next video I'm going to show you how to do a relative macro and what the difference is. So to start out, we have a table of information here, and we want to record a macro that simply formats this table. So I'm in the Developer tab. I'm going to go over here to the code section, and I'm going to click on the Record Macro button, and I'm going to call this format underscore table underscore ABS for absolute, and we'll ignore these other options for a minute. So that's the name of my macro. Well, now I am in macro recording mode. So you'll see this command up here is changed to stop recording. So at this point, everything I do is going to be recorded as part of my macro. So let's start out by selecting this table and going to the Home tab, and we'll put some borders on here, maybe center justify this, add a little background color, and let's see, we'll do some $ formatting or currency formatting, and yeah, that should let's see, what else can we do? Let's put a little background, change the background color up here in the banner, maybe bold those, and that's good enough. Let's go back and stop recording. And before we go and look at our code, let's record one more macro. We're going to call this unformat table ABS for absolute. Actually, we'll just call it unformat ABS. And then we're going to select these cells, and we're going to go to the Home tab, and we're going to go over here, and we're going to say clear format. So that basically wipes out everything we did a minute ago. and resets it. So go back to the Developer tab and stop recording. So now we have created 2 macros, and to look at those macro, actually let's run them first. To run your macro, you just click on this button here, and we'll highlight the one that you want to run, and then click Run. And look at that. And then to run the other one, we'll just select it and do Run. So now we can basically recreate that formatting in just a split second by running our macro. It's really a nice feature. Now if we want to go look at the code, if you click on the Visual Basic Editor, you'll notice there's a new folder here called Modules. Modules are kind of general purpose snippets of your Visual Basic code that are not necessarily explicitly tied to a particular sheet. They're kind of general purpose code that you can use in any sheet, and so they go into this separate folder. And you can have multiple modules, and when we started recording our macros, we didn't have any modules, so it created one. If I were to close this and open it back up and start recording again, it would create a second module and create them, so that you have to kind of get used to that. So here's our code. Here's the format table ABS macro, and you'll notice that the first line says range A4:G7.select. Visual Basic is an object-oriented programming language, and so what we're saying is there's this something called a range object, and you pass to it the name of a cell or a range of cells, and then that basically defines that particular range, and then .select calls what's called a method which selects that range, and so that line of code selects the range, and then that creates what's called a selection object. And then so the next line says selection.borders line style equals, so this next series of commands from here down to here basically applies the borders. Now that's a lot of code, and it turns out that when you record a macro, it seems like it records a lot of extra stuff. So it records code that controls the line style. You can actually, if you know what you're doing, you can go in here and delete a lot of this and make it a little more concise, but it doesn't matter. And then down here, let's see, it says this code centers your text. This changes the fill color. This changes the style to currency. This selects the header, and then this selects the changes the fill color on the header, and this changes the font in the header to bold. Now, you're looking at this thinking, holy cow, that looks complex. Don't worry about it. You don't have to understand all of it. It'll come over time as you look at more and more code. And as we go through these different videos and you read through the Excel VBA primer, this will become very familiar to you. And eventually we're going to start writing code from scratch, and our code will be a lot simpler and more concise than this. But that's how you record a macro, and like I mentioned earlier, one of the great benefits of recording a macro is you can, this always works on that particular range of cells, but if you wanted to apply it to a number of other tables, you could go in and modify the macro code and do that. And so, over the course of the videos in this channel, we're going to occasionally record a macro and then modify it to create it, to make it really more powerful. Now here's our other macro down here, unformat ABS. And by the way, this green text here, this is a comment. If you put a single quote at the beginning of a line, it's just what we call a remark or a comment. It doesn't affect your code in any way. It's just a little label there that Excel put to define what it is that this piece of code does. And this one is really simple. It selects A4 to G11 and then clears the formats. And so sometimes your macros are really short. All right, let's go back to Excel here, and let's do another one. Part 2, record a macro called add plot that creates a line plot from the table. And so in this case, we are going to select this table right here. Actually, let's select everything. Let's see if that works. And whoops, wait a minute. Before we record the macro, we need to select another cell. So do record macro, we'll do add plot. Okay, now I want it, while I'm recording the macro, I want to select that. Then we'll do insert right there, line plot. There we go. So, whoop, I repositioned that chart. I probably shouldn't have done that. I'm going to go back to the Developer tab and click Stop Recording. Now let's go in and look at our code here. So this is add plot. So this selects the cells. This and these next two lines create that chart. Now these last two lines basically move that chart. I don't want to necessarily do that, so I'm going to delete that. And we'll go back to Excel here. Now let's try running that macro. We'll say add plot. Boom, there it is. So I can then delete that, run the macro again, and it adds that chart for us. So again, pretty much anything you want to automate, just start recording, do your steps, stop recording, and then run the macro. I mean, you don't even need to go look at the code. I mean, we did that to learn about it, but if you're just a general purpose user and you want to automate something, you don't even need to be familiar with how the code works. You can just record it and then run it. And so this is a really powerful tool. So that concludes our discussion of how to record a macro and how to record an absolute macro. Now, absolute means that it's always going to do the same thing every time on the same set of cells. And tune into our next video to learn how to do relative macros.